One of the strangest things about money is that the people who seem financially comfortable rarely talk about complicated strategies. They don't constantly discuss stock picks or advanced investment tactics. Instead, when you look closely at their everyday lives, you notice something much quieter. Their habits are different. They spend differently. They think about purchases differently. And over time, those small differences quietly create a huge gap between people who always feel financially stressed and those who seem calm about money. Because financial stability often isn't built through dramatic decisions. It's built through simple habits repeated over many years. Habits that most people barely notice. In this video, we're going to explore 10 minimalist habits that quietly protect people's money and often save them thousands without requiring a higher income. And once you start noticing these habits, you may begin to see exactly why some people always seem financially comfortable. Here's something that rarely gets talked about in personal finance content. Most people who struggle with money aren't bad at math. They're not financially illiterate. They generally understand that saving is important. They know they probably spend too much on things they don't need. They've watched the videos. They've read the articles. And yet somehow the money still disappears. Behavioral economist Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on how people actually make financial decisions, spent decades studying this exact problem. What he found wasn't that people were irrational in a chaotic way. They were irrational in very predictable, very consistent patterns. One of those patterns is something he called mental accounting, the way we mentally divide our money into imaginary categories that affect how freely we spend it. $100 that came as a bonus feels different to spend than $100 from a paycheck, even though the money is identical. And that kind of thinking shapes thousands of tiny spending decisions every year. Morgan Housel, in his book The Psychology of Money, makes a point that cuts even deeper. He argues that wealth is what you don't see. The cars not driven. The clothes not bought. The upgrades declined. We spend enormous mental energy comparing what we have to what other people have, but almost no time noticing what financially stable people quietly choose not to buy. The minimalist habits we're about to explore aren't about deprivation. They're about something more interesting, a different relationship with money and with the things money can buy. Consumer spending research from the Bureau of Labor Statistics consistently shows that American households in the middle income range spend between 12 and 18% of their income on what researchers classify as non-essential expenditure. That's not rent or groceries. That's the subscription that runs quietly in the background. The lunch out because the week felt hard. The upgrade that wasn't really necessary. 12 to 18% on a $50,000 salary is between $6,000 and $9,000 a year. Quietly. Without drama. Without one big reckless purchase. It just leaks out through small habitual decisions made without much thought. That's the real problem. Not a single bad financial choice, but a pattern of small unexamined habits that compound over time. Which is exactly why the habits on this list are so interesting. Because they work the same way, in the opposite direction. Small. Quiet. Repeated. And over time, surprisingly powerful. The first habit is something that sounds almost too simple to be effective. Financially stable people tend to introduce a deliberate pause between the moment they want something and the moment they buy it. Not a complicated system. Just a gap. James Clear, in Atomic Habits, describes a concept he calls implementation intentions, the idea that the environment in which a decision is made shapes the decision itself more than people realize. When you're standing in a store, or scrolling at 11 at night, your environment is designed to make you buy. The lighting, the algorithm, the framing, the social proof, all of it is engineered to compress the gap between desire and purchase. The pause is a way of stepping outside that environment, even briefly. In practice, people describe this in different ways. Some put things in an online cart and wait 3 days before checking out. Others write down what they want to buy in a notes app and revisit it on a specific day of the week. The exact method matters less than the principle behind it. Because what the pause does is separate the emotional urgency of wanting something from the cooler, more practical question of whether you'll actually use it, whether it fits your life, and whether the value justifies the cost. Research published in the Journal of Consumer Research found that consumers who delayed purchasing decisions by even 24 hours reported significantly higher satisfaction with purchases they did make, and significantly lower rates of regret. The pause doesn't just save money. It improves how the money you do spend feels. This matters because most financial regret doesn't come from major purchases. It comes from the accumulation of small, impulsive ones. The jacket you never wore. The gadget that sat unused. The upgrade you got because it seemed like a good idea in the moment. Every one of those small regrets represents money that didn't build anything. The pause is a very quiet way of intercepting those decisions before they happen. The second habit is closely related. Financially stable people tend to buy things in fewer categories. This sounds obvious, but the behavioral dimension of it is more interesting than it first appears. In Your Money or Your Life, Vicki Robin makes a point about what she calls life energy, the idea that every dollar you spend represents a portion of the finite hours of your life that you traded for that money. When you think about purchases in those terms, the question isn't just can I afford this, but is this worth the hours of my life I traded to earn it? That reframing naturally leads people towards spending on fewer things they genuinely value and away from spending diffusely across many categories. Research on happiness and spending, including work by behavioral psychologist Elizabeth Dunn and her collaborators, consistently finds that people derive more lasting satisfaction from spending concentrated in areas that align with their values than from spending spread across many small, low-engagement purchases. The person who spends generously on one or two things they deeply care about and almost nothing on everything else tends to feel more financially satisfied than the person who spends moderate amounts on many things. Buying in fewer categories also has a practical dimension that compounds quietly over years. Fewer categories of spending mean fewer subscriptions, fewer recurring costs, fewer ongoing commitments that slowly eat into a paycheck without delivering equivalent value. The third habit shows up in the way financially stable people approach possessions differently than most. They tend to own fewer things, but those things are almost always better quality. This is sometimes described as the philosophy of buying once, choosing something more expensive upfront that will last for many years rather than buying cheaper versions repeatedly. It's an easy principle to dismiss as something only wealthy people can afford. But the math is more nuanced than that. There's a concept in frugality communities, it gained traction on Reddit's r/frugal and similar spaces, sometimes called the cost per use calculation. Instead of looking at the sticker price of something, you estimate how many times you'll actually use it and divide. A $40 pan you use once a week for 10 years costs less per use than a $12 pan that warps and gets replaced 3 times in the same period. A quality pair of leather boots resold twice outlasts and often outspends 3 pairs of cheaper alternatives. The key insight is that the initial price and the actual cost of ownership are often very different numbers. Financially stable people tend to think in the second number. There's also a psychological dimension to this. Research on what's sometimes called decision fatigue, pioneered in part by social psychologist Roy Baumeister, suggests that the mental energy required to manage, maintain, replace, and evaluate a large number of possessions is a real cognitive cost. People who own fewer, better things report spending less mental energy on logistics and upkeep, which frees attention for other things. Minimalism, in this sense, isn't just a financial strategy. It's an efficiency strategy. The fourth habit is one that gets described consistently by people who've made meaningful financial progress, yet rarely shows up in conventional financial advice. They tend to develop a strong awareness of their own personal spending triggers. Not everyone's triggers are the same. For some people, stress spending is the pattern, a hard week at work leads to a Friday evening of online shopping. For others it's social pressure, buying things to match the visible lifestyle of people around them. For others it's boredom, or the particular vulnerability that comes from browsing late at night when impulse control is at its lowest. Psychologist and financial therapist Brad Klontz, who has spent years studying what he calls money scripts, the unconscious beliefs and behaviors people develop around money, argues that spending behavior is far more emotionally driven than people realize. Most financial advice focuses on the rational mechanics of budgeting. But Klontz's research suggests that until people understand the emotional triggers that drive their spending, the budgets rarely stick. The habit isn't complicated. It's paying enough attention to your own spending patterns to notice when a purchase is emotionally motivated rather than genuinely needed. That awareness, once developed, changes behavior in a way no budgeting spreadsheet can. The fifth habit is about how financially stable people tend to think about convenience spending. This category includes takeout food, delivery fees, last-minute purchases, and anything you pay a premium for because you didn't plan far enough ahead. Convenience spending is one of the most consistent areas where money quietly disappears from middle-income households. It almost never shows up as a problem in a budget, because each individual transaction feels small and justified. But the cumulative cost is significant. A 2023 consumer research report from LendingTree found that the average American who uses delivery apps spends over $300 more per year on food than comparable households who cook at home, just in delivery fees and service charges alone, before accounting for the higher item costs built into many delivery app menus. That's not a judgment about delivery apps. It's a way of illustrating that convenience has a real, consistent price. People who've built financial stability tend to use convenience services deliberately and selectively, rather than as a default response to disorganization. The habit isn't eliminating convenience spending. It's deciding in advance which conveniences are genuinely worth paying for. This connects to a broader principle that J.L. Collins writes about in The Simple Path to Wealth. Financial freedom, Collins argues, isn't primarily about how much you earn, it's about the gap between what you earn and what you spend. Every convenience expense that can be made deliberate rather than automatic is a small contribution to widening that gap. Not dramatically. Not through deprivation. Just through the accumulation of considered choices. The sixth habit is one of the quieter ones, but it has an outsized effect. Financially stable people tend to be remarkably unbothered by what their purchases signal to other people. This isn't about being antisocial or indifferent to appearances. It's about something more specific. They don't make purchasing decisions primarily based on how those purchases will be perceived. They drive cars that work rather than cars that impress. They live in neighborhoods where they're comfortable rather than neighborhoods that communicate success. They wear clothes they like rather than clothes that signal status. Morgan Housel addresses this directly in The Psychology of Money. He describes driving past a person in an expensive car and noting the paradox: the car makes the owner less wealthy than they were before buying it. We use visible consumption as a proxy for financial success because we can't actually see balance sheets or savings accounts. And because other people use it as a proxy, we feel pressure to perform it. But the performance is expensive. Research from Thomas Stanley and William Danko's landmark study The Millionaire Next Door found that a significant portion of high-income earners living with expensive cars and large homes had very little actual wealth, while many genuinely wealthy people lived in modest homes, drove unremarkable cars, and spent very deliberately. The gap between income and wealth, Stanley and Danko argued, was largely explained by lifestyle spending driven by status signaling. The seventh habit is about the relationship financially stable people tend to have with entertainment and leisure. They seem to have identified a small number of things they genuinely enjoy and spend money on those, while maintaining almost no presence in the sprawling landscape of casual, low-engagement entertainment that consumes both time and money for most people. The distinction isn't between enjoying life and not enjoying it. It's between intentional enjoyment and habitual consumption. The average American household now carries between 8 and 12 streaming subscriptions at any given time, according to research from Deloitte's Digital Media Trends report. A significant portion of those subscriptions are rarely or never used. The same pattern shows up in gym memberships, gaming platforms, news subscriptions, and other recurring digital services. What makes these particularly interesting from a behavioral perspective is that they're almost invisible in a budget. Each one is small. None of them feel like a significant decision. But collectively they represent a kind of passive drain, money leaving monthly without a corresponding conscious choice. Financially stable people tend to audit these categories periodically, not dramatically, not as a deprivation exercise, but as a simple maintenance habit. They cancel subscriptions they don't use. They notice when they're paying for things out of inertia rather than genuine enjoyment. And this habit, repeated a couple of times a year, consistently recovers money that was being spent without producing any actual value. The concept is sometimes described in behavioral economics as set and forget spending, recurring charges that get mentally filed away and never reconsidered. Financially stable people seem to have a stronger resistance to letting those charges accumulate. The eighth habit is about how they approach big financial decisions differently from everyday spending. Large purchases, cars, furniture, electronics, home improvements, are where many middle-income households experience the most significant financial leakage. Not because the purchases are inherently unreasonable, but because the decision-making process around them is often compressed by excitement, social pressure, or sales environments designed to accelerate commitment. One of the most reliable findings in consumer psychology research is that the presence of a salesperson, whether in a physical store or through the architecture of an online checkout flow, measurably increases the likelihood of upgrades, add-ons, and spending beyond the original intention. Research from behavioral scientists at the University of Chicago found that people who entered shopping situations with a written, specific decision already made, not just a general plan, but a specific commitment, spent significantly less than those who entered with only a general budget in mind. The act of deciding in advance, before you're in the environment designed to expand your purchase, is one of the most effective ways to control what those large purchases actually cost. Financially stable people tend to do their research, make their decision, and arrive at the point of purchase already decided, not open to persuasion. This sounds minor. But on a car purchase, an appliance, a piece of furniture, or any significant transaction, the difference between arriving with a firm decision and arriving open to suggestions can easily be hundreds or thousands of dollars. The ninth habit is about the relationship financially stable people have with income increases. There is a well-documented behavioral phenomenon called lifestyle inflation, sometimes also referred to as lifestyle creep. It describes the tendency for spending to rise in proportion to income, so that a raise, a bonus, or a higher-paying job produces not more savings but simply more expensive versions of the same life. A bigger apartment. A newer car. Better restaurants. More frequent travel. Each individual upgrade feels earned and reasonable. But the cumulative effect is that the financial gap between income and expenses stays roughly constant regardless of how much income grows. People who build financial stability over time seem to have a particular resistance to this pattern. When income increases, they don't dramatically restrict their lifestyle, but they do delay expanding it. There tends to be a deliberate period, sometimes months, sometimes longer, where extra income is redirected before new spending habits are formed around it. What this does is transform income growth into savings growth rather than lifestyle growth. Over a decade, the difference in outcomes between someone who captures a portion of every raise and someone whose expenses always match their income is dramatic, not because of some heroic act of discipline, but because of a repeated, quiet habit of not immediately spending the new money. The 10th habit is perhaps the most counterintuitive, because it doesn't involve restricting spending at all. It involves spending more generously, but only in the specific areas that generate disproportionate long-term value. Financially stable people tend to spend without hesitation on education, health, tools for their work, and experiences with people they care about, while at the same time spending almost nothing on things that produce no lasting return. This connects to a framework that Elizabeth Dunn and Michael Norton develop in their book Happy Money, where they examine the specific categories of spending that research shows reliably increase well-being, versus the categories where more spending produces diminishing or no return. Their research found that spending on experiences rather than possessions, spending on others as well as yourself, and spending on things that buy back time all produce higher and more lasting satisfaction than equivalent spending on material goods. The financially stable people who practice this habit aren't following Dunn and Norton's research consciously, but they've arrived at the same conclusion through observation and experience. They've noticed which spending generates real value in their lives and which spending generates only temporary satisfaction followed by indifference. What's striking about all 10 of these habits is how undramatic they are individually. None of them require an extreme lifestyle. None of them require a higher salary. None of them require financial expertise or a perfect budget or a sophisticated investing strategy. What they require is something slightly different, a more attentive, more deliberate relationship with the everyday decisions that determine where money goes. Morgan Housel writes near the end of The Psychology of Money that financial success is less about being brilliant with money and more about managing the emotions and behaviors that influence how we use it. The people who seem financially comfortable aren't necessarily the highest earners in the room. They're often just the ones who've developed a set of quiet habits that prevent money from leaking out in ways they'd never actually choose if they were paying attention. That's the real insight buried inside minimalist financial behavior. It's not about wanting less. It's about being more deliberate about what you actually want, and quietly, consistently, letting go of the rest. The habits described in this video aren't transformative on any given day. But repeated across months and years, they produce something that looks, from the outside, like financial ease. And from the inside, like exactly what it is, the steady, quiet result of small decisions made well.